So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to continue what we were doing, which is Surah Nisa. So, we were doing Surah Nisa, and certainly, inshallah, um, yesterday we actually kind of went off track a little bit because of some of the questions, which were important. So, even if we do answer questions, this is not something that is, not containing any ilm. It's basically supposed to be, inshallah, something that brings in the benefit. All right, so yesterday we did ayah number 94 from Surah An-Nisa, page 93. Today, inshallah, we're going to continue the ayah starting from Surah An-Nisa, starting from ayah 95. لا يستوي القاعدون لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين غير أولي الضرر والمجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالهم وأنفسهم فضل الله المجاهدين بأموالهم وأنفسهم على القاعدين درجة وكلا وعد الله الحسنى وفضل الله المجاهدين على القاعدين أجرا عظيما. I'm going to first give like a general translation like you're used to me. لا يستوي, so لا يستوي would mean they're not equal. In other words, there's a preference. One side is preferred over the other. القاعدون من المؤمنين, the ones that are sitting. And of course, this is not talking about somebody that's sitting, but this is a metaphor to speak about sitting and not actually in joining in al-jihad. And this was exclusive to the Battle of Badr at the time. But remember our general قاعدة العبرة بعموم اللفظ إلا بخصوص السبب. Let's write it down again. So remember the whole theme is that العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. So what does that mean? That the theme is really based on the general statement and not necessarily the particular circumstances that the surah was revealed in. لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين. So here, القاعدون من المؤمنين, it doesn't mean that somebody that's sitting down is not the same as somebody that's standing up. Definitely not. Even though the wording, the literal wording would sound like that, but this is القاعدون. It's a metaphor that can mean those that did not join jihad. Min al-mu'mineen, from the believers, of course, because you would basically speak about the battle of Badr. It's important if we're speaking about the battle of Badr here, because with the battle of Badr, of course, the Muslims were not really prepared. They didn't know that they were going to go for the battle. All right, so we had the Prophet ﷺ basically order those that were ready to just head off. But of course, the Muslims were not fighting, not even retaliating for all the 12 years and 9 months. In fact, almost for 14 years, if we were to include the 2 years in Medina as well. So they were not retaliating. They were not fighting. They were ordered to basically just engage in complete peaceful behavior and endurance to the different harm that they were going through. So that's when the ayah was revealed, أذن الذين يقاتلون بأنهم ظلموا وإن الله على نصرهم لقدير. That was when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala later, upon the request for the Muslims to fight, they were the ones that had requested to fight when they were in Medina. And that's when the ayah was revealed. It was giving the permission for those that were persecuted to fight because they were persecuted, definitely. And وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ, and the Lord Almighty is capable of giving them victory. And only the ones that were persecuted, in other words, the immigrants, were the ones that were participating in al-jihad. The Prophet ﷺ did order them to basically join the army, but not everyone joined because not everyone had the arms in the training. Let's see. غير أولي الضرر لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين غير أولي الضرر. In another قراءة غير أولي الضرر. غير أولي الضرر. And now we'll talk about the difference in just a bit. So the ones that are sitting from the believers are not the same as the ones that are going through harm or the ones that are engaging in jihad or in combat for the sake of the Lord Almighty with their wealth or even their life. For the Lord Almighty had preferred those that engage in jihad or engage in combat with their wealth or with their life on the ones that were sitting down daraja, by a step or by a grade or by a level. وَكُلَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهُ الْحُسْنَى. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had all promised the best, but this is not the best. This is a metaphor to mean Jannah. وَفَضَّلَ اللَّهُ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ عَلَى الْقَاعِدِينَ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. And the Lord Almighty had preferred the mujahideen over the ones that were sitting and basically not involved with a magnificent reward. In other words, the ones that had participated in combat are actually preferred with a magnificent combat. So or a magnificent reward. Now I'm going to take you to Tafsir al-Qurtubi right there and just take a couple things. So لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين. Ibn Abbas had said that was actually speaking about those that were going to Badr and those that did not join in Badr. And we just mentioned that the Muslims that had participated in Badr, the Prophet ﷺ just gave a fast order, an unexpected order, whoever's capable of joining jihad to actually join. Amongst the people that did not join in the Battle of Badr was Uthman bin Affan. And the reason why he didn't join was basically because he was married to the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, who was extremely sick. And when the battle ends, the Prophet ﷺ comes back. Indeed, they had won the Battle of Badr, but when he comes back, he hears the noise, the information, and basically that his own daughter was basically dead as a result of the illness. All right, so that was Uthman bin Affan. قال ابن عباس لا يستوي القاعدون عن بدر والخارجون إليها. In other words, speaking about the people of Badr. And I want you to look at this one, because when you look at غير أولي الضرر, والضرر he says الزمانة. What is الزمانة? الزمانة is chronic illness. So that's when we're talking about in modern times we call it مرض مزمن, to mean a long-term permanent illness. But the right Arabic way of saying it is az-zamana, to mean chronic illness. And when you look at this, there is actually a narration for this hadith. Let's look at it. So first we're going to go for number 3, and let's see. So we're looking at that it was narrated in Sahih al-Bukhari, is it? Yeah, so here we go. Let's see. All right, no, it's actually in Lafz Abi Dawood. So this is where, it's in Sahih al-Bukhari, it's in Sahih Muslim, so it's an authentic hadith. It's in Sunan Abi Dawood and also Musnad Ahmad. I know, look at Musnad Ahmad and the number of hadith. That's because Musnad Ahmad is in 6 volumes, but it basically just would contain all those ahadith and would all start Qala Abu Abdullah, because his own son was the one to write those ahadith. All right, and on behalf of his father. All right, وَاللَّفْظُ لِأَبِي دَاوُد. Let's see the story. Zayd ibn Thabit said, I was next to the Prophet ﷺ, and then a sudden pause and a sudden tranquility covered the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, his thigh basically presses on my thigh, and he said, I have not found anything heavier than the thigh that the Prophet ﷺ, basically because of the pressure. And then it was suryan. Suryan, it was basically, then it was an ease that came to him. And then he said, right. And he said, I scribed on, it seemed like what he was scribing on was a shoulder for an animal, dead animal or something like that. It was like a bone, a long bone. And he was scribing on this particular bone. And he scribed, لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين والمجاهدون في سبيل الله. The ones that are sitting from the believers are not equal to the ones that have done jihad. I want you to look at this ayah because it's different than what we have here. All right. So we're talking about لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين غير أولي الضرر was not yet revealed. It said لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين and والمجاهدون في سبيل الله. Let's see. So that's what he scribed first. And then let's see what happened. Then, of course, that was until the end of the ayah. And then Ibn Maktoum. Who's Ibn Maktoum? Ibn Maktoum basically was a blind Sahabi. And when he had heard the preference and, of course, how al-Mujahideen would have a high level, and the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "O Prophet of Allah, how is it with someone that is not capable of engaging in jihad?" Then what just when Ibn Maktoum had basically finished his question, right outright and instantly, the Prophet ﷺ goes into غشية الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم السكينة, like a pause, a pause, and then the Prophet ﷺ's thigh gets heavy. And of course, it gets heavy. And basically, who is it pressing on right now? It's pressing on Zayd ibn Thabit. Pressing on Zayd ibn Thabit. And then he said, I even found the heaviness of that pressure that it was putting. The Prophet's thigh is right next to the Zayd ibn Thabit's thigh, but it seemed like it was a little underneath the Prophet's thigh. And because of that revelation, the heaviness was so strong on Zayd ibn Thabit's thigh. And he said it was even heavier than the first time. And then the Prophet ﷺ goes into Thumma Suryan. Then he goes into, of course, the stage after that, in where it was basically gone, whatever was causing this heaviness. And he said, Iqra ya Zayd. He said, read Zayd. And he said, I read, لا يستوي القاعدون المؤمنين. The Prophet ﷺ then said, غير أولي الضرر, except those that have a reason, except those that have a reason or those that have an illness. The rest of the ayah. Then Zayd said, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed it, and I annexed it. In other words, I put it with it, and by Allah, I could see it right there, as if I could see where exactly it was annexed, where exactly it was added, where exactly it was put, as if I could see the actual scribing of it on that bone itself. A couple things here. Number one is that let's talk about each and every single one here. Zayd ibn Thabit. Who's Zayd ibn Thabit? So Zayd ibn Thabit was one of the young Sahaba. But you could see he was actually sitting with the men as well. He was in his early teenage during this time, and it's important to mention that in Islam, a teenager is considered an adult. Okay, maybe not necessarily held accountable as a mature adult. Remember the beginning of Surah Nisa, we talked about فإن آنستم منهم رشدا فدفعوا إليهم أموالهم. When we talked about what makes an adult is basically a rushd. In other words, not because they're adults that or considered adults, it doesn't mean that we would give them all the responsibility of probably handling their money issues or probably handling some decision making, etc., because they did not reach yet the level of maturity, but they are still held accountable as adults. In other words, their body had they physically developed, and therefore they should be capable of handling the responsibilities as an adult. Let's see. When we speak about Zayd ibn Thabit, of course, Zayd ibn Thabit, the Prophet the famous thing is that the Prophet was giving him one to scribe. So he was from Katabat al-Wahi. What are Katabat al-Wahi? Let me write that name down. So Katabat al-Wahi are basically the ones to scribe al-Wahi, the ones to scribe the revelations. And here Zayd ibn Thabit was scribing right on the spot. It was revealed right in front of him. So he said, I was next to the Prophet ﷺ, and of course, a couple things about the story in where Zayd ibn Thabit says, I was next to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was feeling the heaviness. The heaviness of what? Why was the Prophet ﷺ doing all of that? What was happening? Remember when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said in Surah al-Muzammil, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ إِنَّا سَنُلْقِي عَلَيْكَ قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا, heavy words. So the heavy words definitely was one, a metaphor, but this is also heavy in where it wasn't just the Prophet ﷺ that was heavy. There were other incidents where the Prophet ﷺ was getting the revelation when he was on a camel's back, and the camel would collapse from the heaviness of the words, the heaviness of the words, the heaviness of the words, the malaika, the Jibril alayhi salam being very heavy in even scribing it. Let's see another occasion where the Sahaba would say that whenever the Prophet ﷺ would get a revelation, they would hear a buzzing sound in the background. So they don't hear exactly the words, but they would hear some buzzing sound in the background. So the other question is, well, how does the Prophet ﷺ hear the words? And the Prophet ﷺ had said that the words would sound like it's a very strong ringing sound, as if it's a bell right into his ear, so that the Prophet ﷺ would actually hear it. So when you look at, well, what is the silence and the tranquility that he went into, and where it was just a sudden silence? Different Orientalists would say, well, that's a sign of epilepsy. So the Prophet ﷺ's eyes would not flip. The Prophet ﷺ, he would not look in any way of what we would see in a symptom, or even in the kind of epilepsy that you would find, or the signs of epilepsy. So you would not see that the Prophet ﷺ forgot anything. You would not see that the Prophet ﷺ was confused about anything. You would not see that he went into any twitching, or in any type of an eye flip, or any type of losing control of his body. So it was not at all of anything like epilepsy whatsoever. It was completely different. Even you could see this hadith, and even the Sahaba themselves, of hearing a buzzing sound in the background. You could see that right there, the Prophet ﷺ was completely alert. They would see him reading, sometimes repeating, and they would see the Prophet ﷺ actually looking red from the heaviness, and actually seeing his body being heavy and calm. So it was not whatsoever any sign of that. And right there, so the Prophet ﷺ orders him to write the ayah, but then when Ibn Maktoum, an idea about Ibn Maktoum. Ibn Maktoum was a blind man. Ibn Maktoum, he's the same Sahabi, he was completely blind, so not legally blind, but completely blind. Ibn Maktoum, he was basically mentioned and referred to in Surah Abasa, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually said, Abasa wa tawalla an ja'ahu al-a'ma. Abasa wa tawalla, speaking about the Prophet ﷺ when he had frowned. What was happening? The Prophet ﷺ was speaking to a chieftain, al-Walid ibn al-Mughira and Umayyah ibn Khalaf. He was talking to them about Islam. They were asking questions. Who comes in? Ibn Maktoum, Abdullah ibn Maktoum. He comes in and he starts asking questions. But what happened is that the Prophet ﷺ had frowned at the time because he was busy with a chieftain. But the Prophet ﷺ was reprimanded in Surah Abasa, in where considered that you should not have frowned at the blind man who was actually coming seeking tazkiyah, seeking questions to get answered in regards to tazkiyah. So, عبس وتولى أن جاءه الأعمى وما يدريك لعله يزكى أو يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى. Yet, أما من استغنى, for those that basically did not care, that basically had no concern. أما من استغنى فأنت عنه فأنت له تصدى. فأنت له تصدى, the one that did not show any concern, you basically, on the other hand, were showing a lot of concern to talk to them. But the one that was really concerned to learn, you frowned at him. So this is a type of, and Sayyidah Aisha had said, if the Prophet ﷺ had hidden any ayat, he would have probably hidden this ayah, but he didn't, because the Prophet ﷺ never hid any ayah or any revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is it, Ibn Maktoum. Abdullah ibn Maktoum, another thing is that he was sent with Mus'ab ibn Umayr to Medina. When Mus'ab ibn Umayr was only around 16 years old, he sends him off to Medina and along with Abdullah ibn Maktoum to give da'wah in Medina. Remember, the Prophet wasn't there. There were no Muslims. And of course, this teenage boy is not going to engage in some kind of gaming. I'm away from my family, etc. No, he's a man and understands he's on a mission. All right. So then the ayah was revealed. Let's stick to that point in where when the ayah was revealed in the beginning, لا يستوي القاعدون المؤمنين والمجاهدين في سبيل الله, then the Prophet ﷺ orders that within between this ayah, when Ibn Maktoum said, well, what about the person that is ill, like a person that is not capable of going to jihad? What about them? Because he was definitely wanting to go. And by the way, it's important to mention that Ibn Maktoum, although he was not capable of engaging in any form of combat, he still went and joined the number of jihad, the number of mujahideen. Why? When he was asked why, he said, at least I'll just add a number, even if I cannot be involved in the actual combat. I'll just be a number there. In other words, I'll give that support. Sometimes he would also lead salah. So, this is what he could do. In whatever he could do, he just wanted to be within the number. All right, so that's when غَيْرُ أُولِي الضَّرَرِ. There is another قراءة غَيْرَ أُولِي الضَّرَرِ. We'll talk about it in just a bit. So let's continue right there. وفي البخاري عن مقسم مولى عبد الله بن الحارث أنه سمع ابن عباس يقول لا يستوي القاعدون المؤمنين عن بدر والخارجون إلى بدر. We explained that one. So let's see, in terms of that tafsir. So okay, let's look at that ayah again. So the ayah would basically say those that are not involved in combat, basically al-qa'idun, sitting at home, or at least sitting out and not involved in a jihad, and غير أولي الضرر, unless they had an excuse. And of course, الضرر could also mean blindness. So الضرر can be a general statement to mean if a person is harmed. And الضرر, that's why we would call somebody that is blind ضرير. الضرير is basically the person that is blind. ضرير. Now the root is ضرر, to mean to be harmed or harm, to harm or to be harmed. All right. So here غير أولي الضرر, basically except those that, now the word أولي in لغة عربية basically means the companions of something. So the companions of harm. So this is a metaphor to mean those that have a constant harm, or those that would have, let's say, accompanying them harm. So those that are accompanied by harm. All right. So this is what uli would mean. So uli can sometimes mean companion and could also mean something is accompanying something. So what do they have? Well, something is accompanying them. What is it? Well, it's basically harm. Now you see that uli, and ulat is for feminine. This is masculine, and ulat is for feminine. Let's go back to our tafsir al-Qurtubi. Let's see. صح وثبت في الخبر أنه عليه الصلاة والسلام قال وقفل عن بعض غزواته إن بالمدينة رجالا ما قطعتم واديا ولا سرتم مسيرا إلا كانوا معكم أولئك قوم حبسهم العذر. I want to look at this hadith. That there are men in Medina, every time you would go or pass by a valley, or you would walk any distance, but in fact, they are uh, with you. That means not with you physically, but with you. أولئك قوم حبسهم العذر. Those are the people that were basically prevented from joining along a reason. So what does that even mean? So the Prophet ﷺ was basically telling us the people that have a reason not to join the army, but had the intention or the will to do a particular good deed, they would also be included. So even if they physically were not there, but they would get the same equal reward, even if, as if they were passing by a valley or probably passing a certain distance or joining in any kind of an effort, including, and of course, contributing in any form of effort, that they would basically get the equivalent reward as if they were really physically there. Now, that's the same thing. Let's say you had the intention that you wanted to go for Taraweeh, but then you got your period. Okay. You got your period. You really wanted to go. You really had the will to go. You really wanted that to really happen, but you just got your period. So the Prophet ﷺ is basically telling you, just by having the intention, even if you had al-udhr and you really had the reason, the valid reason not to go, then you would actually get the equivalent reward as if you had actually went. So that's important to keep in mind. Have and put your intention to do what is good, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give you the reward as if you were actually there. Same thing. We're not just talking about Taraweeh, but same thing. Let's say you wanted to join a retreat, you wanted to go for Umrah, but then your husband tells you, you could see that your son is sick right now. Sorry, but you can't really go right now because your son is sick, but you really wanted to go, and if it wasn't for your husband actually telling you right now that, sorry, but we can't afford to basically take days off work, so you have to really dismiss and not join in the group and go for Umrah, you would get the same reward. All right, you would get the same reward, or even though you were not physically with the group, you did not physically go. So this is just why, just to keep that in mind, because it happens a lot where you really want to go, but it could be, as women, it could be that your husband told you that you can't go. You had a udhr. This is a udhr. This is a reason. Of course, obedience to the husband is basically obligatory. So this is just to help you recognize or whether the udhr. And speaking about udhr, let's actually write that down. In where there are a number of different types of udhr. There is al-udhr, basically, that is a reason, a valid reason. So the question is, well, what makes a valid reason? A valid reason could be something physical. It could be something that, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered you to obey your husband or obey your father. He told you not to go. So therefore, this would be a valid reason. There is something called ashab al-a'dhar. I want you to just, this ashab al-a'dhar, it's actually a particular term. Ashab al-a'dhar. Who are ashab al-a'dhar? Ashab al-a'dhar is a term in fiqh. So technically, literally, it means those that had an excuse, but what it means is not those that had an excuse. It is a technical term to mean those that have a reason to combine, or at least to basically pray with that wudu. So they've got a reason, that's constant reason that's happening. So even if the reason was still happening, but they would still only need to make one wudu for that particular prayer. What does that look like? So let's say somebody is having incontinence, okay? With that incontinence, it's going to be constant. It's not something that they could control. It's basically constant. And even if they were to make wudu 2 minutes later, a minute later, or maybe right while they're making wudu, their body is discharging urine right there. So these are the people that every single salah, the reason that basically breaks the wudu is constantly there. So for these people, they just make wudu for every salah. What if it is too hard for them to make wudu for every salah? It is considerable opinion for the Maliki madhab that if we're talking about the same reason why they're considered and included in having the reason, valid reason to basically combine prayers or even pray even when that reason is still happening, for the Maliki madhab, that they don't necessarily have to redo their wudu for every salah for the same exact reason that they were basically considered as ashab al-adhar. So in other words, what they were saying, let's say a person was having incontinence, okay? So as long as the reason is incontinence all the time, that they don't need to make wudu for dhuhr and then wudu for asr and then wudu for maghrib, but they could actually consider that that reason is basically not included with the wudu breakers. So if they would pass gas, that would mean that their wudu is broken, but not the actual urine that they're probably right now dealing with. Or let's give something that is probably more common with women, istihada. Istihada is basically any vaginal bleeding that is not postpartum and not menstrual. Simple. If I were to say, what is istihada? That's it. The definition. It's any vaginal bleeding that is not postpartum and not menstrual. Simple. Okay. That's the easiest way to define it without going to all the different details. So regardless of the reason. So if the sister was going and considered as part of Ashab al-Adhar, she would basically just consider that I've got a valid reason right there. And all I need to do, if I would want to stay according to the majority of scholars, I would basically just consider that I had that reason, and therefore I would just need to make wudu for every salah. All right. Let's also, let's say when we're talking about al-udhr in this circumstance, in udhr basically not being able to join in jihad. So whether they were ill, probably they didn't have the money to buy weapons, for example, they didn't have I guess that circumstance suiting for them to go, then that situation they would be included. So the same thing when we're speaking about in another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ even speaks about whoever would whoever would be participating. So whoever is participating in any form of a good deed. So what does that look like? Let's say they're building a masjid. All right? They're building a masjid. And you basically donate to build the masjid, or you donate to probably feed the workers, or you donate to probably get the license, all of that. That would be included in building the masjid. Same thing. Let's say we're talking about publishing a book. You basically donated in probably publishing the book, printing the book. You would get the same included reward as the person that's writing the book. All right, let's give another example. Let's say we're basically having a Quran class. All right, whether you were feeding the group or whether you were paying for the air condition, or whether you are basically paying the teacher, or whether you are basically driving, paying the drivers to bring the students, you would basically be included in the reward as if you are the teacher himself. As if you are the teacher himself. So this is important to keep in mind. So each and every single contribution would basically be part, and of course, as if it is included in this ayah. All right. So let's continue. And the question is if this ayah is basically saying that they're not equal. All right. Okay, we understand the people that have a reason, but the ones that are sitting down, they're not equal to the mujahideen, the ones that actually went for jihad and got involved. And I want you to look at over here. المجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالهم وأنفسهم. I want you to look at how the ayah had actually mentioned al-amwal first, the money first, contribution in money as a precedent over contribution in life. This is extremely important because many times we don't recognize that the contribution of wealth, and of course, certainly how much of an impact it has in making it possible to change a lot of the odds. I think that's one main reason. That's one main reason why many times the ummah, at least in, for example, in America, I think we're really behind in where we don't recognize how to let our money and use our money, and we don't understand what it means to actually use the money to, whether it's we're talking about a nonprofit organization or probably push forward or even have an influence on media or have an influence on politicians or have an influence on ground. And I think we've been within our societies, the Muslim societies, let's call them back home, there was something called the waqf. What is it, waqf? Al-waqf is a system, an Islamic system, where it was the government's responsibility to fund the different work that was considered public work. So whether we're talking about public water fountain, masjid, it was a school, a hospital, all of those were considered some of it was public property to mean government property, and some of it was waqf property to mean that it was given as a donation for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that it was not public, it was not government property, but it was basically designated to be for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was sadaqah jari. As long as it's there, it's sadaqah jari. Now, that contribution that basically was called waqf, the Muslim ummah and a lot of the Muslims that basically have gotten so used to al-waqf system, when they right now live under a secular system, they would think that the imam or the masjid or basically is supposed to be working on its own, not recognizing that the waqf system is not there, that the waqf system is not there. So in order to make the masjid, if you want a beautiful a couple $1 million masjid, well, it can't happen unless you actually participate, unless you actually make it happen. It's not going to happen on its own. So when you're looking at المجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالهم, it's also to tell us that contributing in money, in making things happen, whether it's a masjid, whether it's an Islamic school, whether it's any activity, etc., all of that is going to be a contribution with the wealth, in where it would simply be as if the person had contributed in their life itself, or let's say physically. And this is important to keep in mind, because many times people don't regard the contribution in wealth of anything, when we could see that sometimes you can have certain ayat actually take you into speaking about the contribution of wealth preceding the contribution of your own physical life. And sometimes you would see ayat in where putting or at least preceding the contribution of life over wealth. And at the end, we would be talking about two things. Number one is that the sincerity, and number two is basically the circumstance at the time. Do we more need at the time the contribution of probably people, let's call it the labor workers, or people to basically be involved in probably making the activity and having people involved? Or is this speaking about to actually have the money? Which one basically is more important at the time? So when you look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically saying لا يستوي القاعدون and المجاهدين, in other words, there's a certain level in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded those that were participating in combat with their wealth. Again, it said with their wealth and even with their life, even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them a higher level or higher status, or simply a higher reward. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُلًّا وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الْحُسْنَى. And each, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so kullan would mean each. Wa'ada, promised, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised al-husna. Al-husna here could be, number one, al-ahdiyah. Remember, if we would have al, it can be a particularized al, or it could be an inclusive al, to mean what does al-husna actually mean? So literally, husna means good. Okay, it literally means good. But al-husna, if it is considered a particularized kind of al-husna, to mean a particular al, that would mean this would be talking about Jannah. This would be speaking about Jannah. Yet, if it's an inclusive al, it would be basically that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised good, just a good reward, good result, good ending, good life, good akhirah. That would be in the inclusive al, to just mean any type of good. فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ عَلَى الْقَاعِدِينَ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. So at the end is that those that would be involved were in jihad, in combat, are preferred basically by a magnificent reward. So an ajr is basically reward. Now, it's important to mention that the word ajr is different than other words, because ajr would be a compensation, would be a trade of something. Remember when we talked about ajr before, and we said it's basically when you put any type of an investment. All right, so al-ajr would be the money, or whatever in return you would get. Okay, ajran azima. And here it didn't say al-ajr al-azim. It said ajran azima. In Lugha Arabiya, when the word is not defined, so here you're talking about a sifa, or basically an adverb or an adjective that is when you're saying that it's not defined, it's not saying al-ajr al-azim, but it is saying ajran azima. All right. In other words, there's no defining article in it. In that situation, al-ajran azima would be more comprehensive than al-ajr al-azim. Why? Because ajran azima is telling us that it is not basically limited. It is unlimited, magnificent reward. Unlimited, magnificent reward. That's what that word would basically look like. If we were to say al-ajr al-azim, it would be limited. Yes, it's magnificent, but it's basically a limited, magnificent reward. But ajran azim is an unlimited, magnificent reward. All right, and let's see. Al-Qurtubi here says, so the first one, that is, of course, sahib al-udhr, the person that had a reason. Are they going to be getting the same equal reward based on this ayah? So the person that has a reason not to go, all right, the person that has a reason not to go. So here, غَيْرُ أُولِي الضَّرَرِ. In another qira'ah, غَيْرَ أُولِي الضَّرَرِ. So wait a minute. Are they going to be getting the same reward? Or is this actually saying they're not going to get the same reward? So according to al-Qurtubi, let's look at what he says. According to al-Qurtubi, he says, قلت, that is al-Qurtubi, والقول الأول أصح, which is that صاحب العذر يعطى أجر الغازي, that the person that had a reason not to join would basically be given the same reward as the person that went in combat. And he says the evidence for that is basically this hadith that we had said, إن بالمدينة رجالا ما قطعتم واديا ولا سرتم مسيرا إلا كانوا معكم. Every time there are certain men in Medina that every time you would go into a valley, you would go and cross a certain distance, they would be considered as if they were physically with you. Those are the people that basically had a reason not to join. So therefore they're actually included. And let's see, in another hadith, let's see this hadith number 4. We're going to go back to footnote number 4, and he said Ibn Abi Shayba had actually mentioned this hadith, and it is عند البخاري. It was mentioned عند البخاري with this hadith number: إذا مرض العبد أو سافر كتب له مثل ما كان يعمل مقيما صحيحا. Allahu Akbar. So what happened is that the Prophet ﷺ said, if the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sick, or they go on a journey, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically scribe the good deed that they used to do consistently, as if when of course they were muqiman, when they were residents and when they were healthy. So let's say every single day you're basically let's just give an easy example. Okay, let me think of one. So let's assume every single day you were helping, or you were cooking, you were cleaning the house, you were doing everything, you were being good to your husband, all of that, every single day. But there was a day you got really ill. You couldn't get up. You couldn't do anything. It was something that basically had prevented you from doing what you would normally do.
A period?
A period. Okay, a period. So in that situation, even though you are not physically doing the good deed, but it would be considered as if you are doing it, because what prevented you from doing it is an illness, or what prevented you from doing it, probably that you had an urgent travel. You traveled, you did, or had an urgent reason that prevented you from doing the good contribution. And that's why in the hadith, let's see, إذا مرض العبد قال الله تعالى اكتبوا لعبدي ما كان يعمله في الصحة إلى أن يبرأ أو أقبضه إلي. يا سلام. He said, if my servant is sick, the Lord Almighty would say, write and scribe for my servant what they used to do when they were healthy, until they would basically ما كان يعمله في الصحة, what they used to do while they were healthy, until they would basically get final cure. أو أقبضه إلي, or of course أقبضه إلي, or until, in other words, continue writing the deeds until they're basically taken up to me, that is in death. That is in death. So in other words, continue doing the good deeds. Let's say there is a hadith. I want to look at this hadith. عن أبي كبش الأنماري قال صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الدنيا لأربعة نفر. I'm going to take you to this hadith because this hadith is actually important. I'm going to change the... Okay, now we're going to take you to this hadith, even though he didn't actually say it. إنما الدنيا لأربعة نفر. Okay, I'm going to take you to this hadith because this hadith is going to help us understand a couple things. Okay, let's see. And I like this website. I want you to look at this. You know what? I'm going to show you those websites really quick. Okay, I want you to see it. So here we go. I wrote إنما الدنيا لأربعة نفر. And this website is actually a trusted website, aluka.net. A trusted website has really good articles. Islam Web, really good website, has very good scholars that are writing all these articles. Durar.net is actually a very good website, and they did a lot of good work in hadith. We're going to get to it in just a bit. Islamqa.info. It's a very good website because they would answer questions. They would try to, a lot of times, put in the different details of differences of opinions and the evidences and so forth. So that would, المكتبة الشاملة is a website. That is a library. It is a library where it had all these Islamic books, great books. And Sayd al-Fawaid is not at the same level because some articles, they're not written in the best way. So I guess different people would be writing articles not written in the best way, but it's still considered a good website to go back to. And let's go back to that website, durar.net. Very good website. And what I like about that website is that they would get you the hadith and they would tell you right there. So here's a Rawi, basically the narrator, and al-Muhaddith al-Albani, in where he basically had included his takhrij, or his commentary on that hadith. And he said that that hadith is basically sahih, and would give you all of that. And what's nice about it is that so many times they would even include the other hadith that give the same meaning, and then they would go in details about what that actually means. Well, I mean, it's written in Arabic. I can't even benefit from that. Remember what you could do. You can go these little three dots right here, and you can go to translate, and you can make it translate into English, and voila, you got it right there. The example of this nation is like the example of four people: a man to whom God has given wealth and knowledge. So he uses his knowledge with his money and spends it in what is rightful to him. And a man to whom God has given knowledge, but not given him money. So he says, if I had like of this, I would do for it the same as the one who does. The messenger of God, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, they are equal in reward. And a man to whom God has given wealth but not knowledge, so he is lost in his money and spends it in a way that is not right. And a man to whom God has given knowledge or wealth, who has not given knowledge or wealth, he says, if I had such a thing, I would do it the same way that the one who does it in. The messenger of God, may peace and blessing be upon him, said, they're equal in the burden. They're equal in the burden. In other words, equal in the sin. Why did I even say this hadith? Because it's important to understand that every single contribution that you would include. So let's say you were like, oh, if only I had this knowledge, I would actually be doing more da'wah. If only I had more money, I would actually buy a masjid, and I would buy an orphanage, and I would do this. If, let's say, in other words, you basically wished, and this is equal to another hadith. I want to look at this hadith because, even if you basically had, let's look at another hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, La hasada illa fitnatain. Let's look at this hadith and actually see what this hadith says, because I want you to see it. Let's see this hadith. La hasada إلا على اثنتين. In another narration, إلا في اثنتين. رجل آتاه الله مالا فهو ينفق معه آناء الليل وآناء النهار، ورجل آتاه الله القرآن فهو يقوم به آناء الليل وآناء النهار. So what does that mean? Let's actually do the translation. Right now, you guys can actually see, I'm going to get you used to this. There's no envy except for two things: a man to whom God has given wealth, so he spends from it during the night and during the day, and a man to whom God has given the Quran, so he spends with it. In other words, he reads with it during the night and during the day. So in other words, to actually have that intention, or at least I wished I had the ability to read Quran like that. This actually takes me to a story. Really interesting. My sister was telling me that she was in Masjid al-Aqsa. There was this lady who was holding the Quran and going over the words. So my sister gets closer to her, and she noticed that she was holding the Quran upside down and going over the words really quick, just quickly. So my sister says, Hajja, do you actually know how to read? And she said, I don't have time, and continues to go over one line after another, flipping a page, going one line after another, flipping the page, going one line after another. But of course, the Quran is upside down. So my sister said, Hajja, why don't we flip the Quran? This is better. She accepted that it would get flipped and continued to do what she was doing. And she said, Hajja, do you think you can go slower over the words? So she starts going slower over the words. Once she finished, she asked her, Hajja, can you actually read? She said, no. She said, what are you doing then? She said, I don't know how to read, but at least I'll show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I tried. And she was just going over the words. What will she get? She will get the reward, inshaAllah, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even though she didn't actually read anything, but she just wanted to at least go over the lines and just let her eyes see those words as if she was actually reading. Ya Allah, this story really gives me the goosebumps, because it's, when you see the hardship that others would go through, and when you look at this hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet ﷺ tell you that even if the person was not capable of doing the good deed, just by having the intention, just by having at least the dream to do something, that is in itself making a change. And this is important. Even if you're not capable of doing something, at least have the intention, at least have the will, at least be a person on the inside. That is the start. In other words, what's more important than doing the work is actually having sincerity in your commitment, even if you didn't have the tools to actually do the work. That's the start. That's even more important than the work itself, because it can happen that a person can do the work and not actually be rewarded for it. Remember the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, maybe we can take you to the hadith and actually see for yourself and really learn how to read it. All right, let's see. In the hadith, let's look at it. And here's the hadith. I want you to actually see it. And let's take you to it. The Prophet ﷺ in the hadith actually said, I don't want, let's see. And we're going to go for doer al-Saniyah right there, the Saniyah. So let's see. The Prophet ﷺ actually said, let's see. Okay, where's the hadith that I wanted? Okay, hold on. I'm going to find it. Don't worry. Let's see. We're going to get there. Okay, let's see. All right, let's see. Here's the hadith. So the hadith basically says that the Prophet Abu Hurairah says that there on Judgment Day, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically rule by different people, but then he says that أول من تسعر بهم النار. So here we go. The Prophet ﷺ basically says that there are certain people, the first ones, let's look, get it right there so you could actually see it. The first ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would call on to a man who basically was reading the Quran, another who was actually killed fi sabilillah, and a man who had a lot of wealth, and they were basically donating it. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell the person that recited the Quran, did you not know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed onto the Prophet? He said, oh yes, I do. And then I did, Lord. And I had actually done what you had ordered me what to do with it. And I would recite all night and all day with the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, you're actually a liar. And the malaika would say, you're a liar. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, you actually did it because you wanted it to be said about you that you are a reciter. And it was said. And it would also be brought with the man that had the money. And he would say, did not give you a lot of money, an abundance of money, and not make you in need of people? He said, oh, absolutely, Lord. And I had done exactly what you had asked me to do. So I would visit my relatives and I would spend on them and I would donate. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, you're a liar. And the malaika would say, you're a liar. But you actually wanted to do that in order for people to say that you are hospitable, generous. And it was said, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would take him as well. In other words, and then another person basically was killed for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, mujahid, a combat. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, what did you do? And he said, you ordered that people would engage in jihad in your cause. And I did, and I basically had been killed for what I was doing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would say, you're a liar. And the malaika would say, you're a liar. But the reason why you did it is because you wanted everyone to say and consider you that you were brave, that you were courageous. And so it was said. And the Prophet ﷺ had basically hit on the thigh of Abu Hurairah to bring his attention. And he said, those are the first three that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically let the hellfire blaze on them. So not because somebody is reciting the Quran, and this, you could see this hadith right here, it is as Ibn Hibban and Ibn Khuzaymah, and it is also in the Sahih as well. You could see that this hadith is an authentic hadith. So not because a person is doing a particular behavior, it doesn't mean that they're going to get the reward for it, only if sincerity was involved in it. If sincerity was not involved in it, then they would actually not get the reward.
So
for
even
it.
if people weren't saying it right and they really made that,
What does it mean, Noura, even if they weren't saying it right?
I mean, because there we have Ustada Alia. She does the
Oh, you mean
Khatam class.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and all of us sisters, we're trying and stuff. There's sisters who are really good at reading it,
Al-Qur'an.
mashallah.
Right.
But so what do you recommend for that?
Right. So
Because you don't want to say it wrong, but like you want to try,
Right. So there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually mentioned, all right, I'm going to actually take you, I'm going to take you there to actually see the hadith. I want you to see it. All right. I want you to see the hadith. That way you could see it yourself. All right. Let's see. So there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, let's look at it. Let's look at this hadith right there, in where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, here it is. The hadith is muttafaqun alayh. It is agreed upon between scholars. Sayyidah Aysha said, the Prophet ﷺ said, الذي يقرأ القرآن وهو ماهر به مع السفرة الكرام البررة والذي يقرأ القرآن ويتعتع فيه وهو عليه شاق له أجران. Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ, let's do the translation and actually see if it does a good translation, because there are some right there. On the authority of Sayyidah Aysha, may Allah be pleased with her, the messenger said, he who recites the Quran, it is skilled at it with the honorable and righteous travelers. Not an accurate translation. This is not a traveler, but this is actually the highest level of malaika. And he who recites the Quran and stumbles in it, even though it is difficult for him to do so, basically is given 2 rewards. So the translation didn't do a good job this time. All right, so now we're translating it to make it clear for you. The one that reads the Quran and is skilled or is good and basically fluent in it is basically with السفرة الكرام البررة, the highest level of the malaika. And the one that stumbles and is finding it hard to read the Quran, the word يتكعتع فيه, it's like they would read and they're يقولوا, and they're trying to read it, but they're definitely, working so hard to get it. And that person would basically get two rewards for it. So let's say Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he said the same thing, something similar. مثل المؤمن الذي يقرأ القرآن مثل الأترجة ريحها طيب وطعمها طيب ومثل المؤمن الذي لا يقرأ القرآن كمثل التمرة لا ريح لها طعمها حلو ومثل المنافق الذي يقرأ القرآن كمثل الريحانة ريحها طيب وطعمها مر ومثل المنافق الذي لا يقرأ القرآن كمثل الحنظلة ليس لها ريح وطعمها مر. Now that's going to be a hard thing to translate. Let's say the messenger, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically the messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may God be pleased and grant him peace. The example of a believer, of a person who reads the Quran, is like the citrus fruit. Well, al-utruja is not a citrus fruit. It's a kind of a citrus fruit. It kind of looks like dragon fruit. Does it? No. Al-utruja, well, it kind of looks like a dragon fruit, but it's not a dragon fruit. Its scent is pleasant and its taste is pleasant. And the example of a believer who does not read the Quran is basically as a date. So it has no scent, but the taste is sweet. And it is given an example on the hypocrite who reads the Quran like a basil, like the basil, the basil leaf. Its fragrance is pleasant, but the taste is bitter. And the example of a hypocrite who does not read the Quran is like a cocoon. It has no fragrance and its taste is bitter. So when you look at that, handara is it a cocoon? Okay. ليس لها ريح, doesn't. So this is that comparison. So when you look at the person that is basically trying to read, and we already did this hadith, لا حسد إلا في اثنتين رجل آتاه الله القرآن فهو يقوم به آناء الليل وآناء النهار ورجل آتاه الله مالا فهو ينفقه آناء الليل وآناء النهار. So you would basically envy a person that basically reads the Quran and throughout the day and throughout the night they're reading it and you're like, oh, I wish I could do the same. I wish I had that ilm. I wish I had the knowledge. Well, put in the contribution. It starts with you having that will, that intention, that inner will that I want to be like that. And the same thing when we're talking about somebody that had the money. Even if you don't have the money, at least have the intention. If I had that money, I would actually donate this much. I would give and do this much and so forth. Now, scholars actually had different opinions on the reward, whether it is really equal if a person were to do other things. So let's say we're talking about maybe if we were to compare the ayah right there, let's look at the ayah right there, and where the ayah was talking about, yes, people that are doing jihad, people that are not capable of joining. What about somebody that is probably working on the other end, maybe on the computer, trying to make videos of probably as a PR, let's say it that way, as a PR to encourage people to join jihad or whatever it is, or it doesn't have to be jihad. To, let's say they're doing they're working from home, they're basically doing classes from home, or probably teaching Quran from home, or probably they're just doing flyers. They don't know how to teach Quran, they don't know how to do all of that, they just know how to make flyers, they know how to make a website, they know how to pass out the flyers, or someone else, they're basically just contributing in wealth, they would get the reward of the person that's actually doing the job. That's important to keep in mind. They basically get the reward as if they're doing the job. And of course, since I came across Ibn Muhayriz, I really wanted to talk about him, but we'll talk about him later on. And of course, the scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether a person that is poor is better than a person that is rich, and how. I don't want to go into all of those. Let's see. Okay, remember when we did the recitation? I want you to go over here and see. We said there's a qira'ah ghayra, and there's a qira'ah ghayra, and there's a qira'ah ghayru. All right, I want you to look at this, because when you look at the different qira'ah, so the first one would be describing the mu'mineen, and the second one would be so ghayril mu'mineen. So here we go. There's a qira'ah ghayri even. There's a qira'ah ghayra, and there's the qira'ah that we're doing is ghayru. All right. I want you, Arabi is so detailed. So there's a qira'ah ghayru, ghayra, and ghayri. So what does that mean? They're confused? No, they're not confused. So the first one, in where we're looking at al-qira'ah, if it is saying ghayru uli darar, that would basically be describing al-qa'idun. So لا يستوي القاعدون غير أولي الضرر. So that would be describing al-qa'idun, except those that are not sitting, of course, that have an illness. And ghayra or ghayri would be describing the mu'mineen, because the mu'mineen, min al-mu'mineen, basically jaru majroor right there, and would basically be describing min al-mu'minina ghayri uli darar. So what would the meaning really be? The meaning would basically just exclude, I guess it's just an issue of excluding, I guess, where is that exclusion from the believers or from al-qa'idin? But at the end, let's say the implication is really the same, which is that somebody that is not capable of joining in the battle would basically get the same reward. فضل الله المجاهدين بأموالهم وأنفسهم على القاعدين درجة. We talked about that in where when we're speaking about a daraja, are we talking about a step? Are we talking about a level? Are we talking about a status? At the end of the day, is that this daraja would basically be resembled in a level in al-Jannah. It would basically be a level in al-Jannah. And certainly some scholars had actually said daraja is to mean that the Lord Almighty أعلى ذكرهم ورفعهم بالثناء والمدح والتقريض. What does that even mean? Listen to this. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, when you look at throughout history, there were many scholars out there. Many scholars, they did a lot of contribution, but they had been forgotten. The ones to be remembered are really the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had a'la dhikrahum, had elevated their mention. It could be because of a sincerity that they had been contributing in. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the scholars here say that when we're speaking about daraja, to mean that they would be recognized, whether it's in this dunya or whether it's in the akhirah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would praise them and would elevate their mention above all. And some scholars said that darajat or daraja is basically to speak about a certain level. Let's see, Ibn Muhayriz. It's a different name, isn't it? Let's talk about Ibn Muhayriz. He basically said it's 70 different levels, and between each and every single level is basically the distance of what a strong knight would basically travel in 70 years. Okay, who's Ibn Muhayriz? Now, remember this. Ibn Muhayriz, I want you to please focus with me, because this one is important, at least for us to get the inspiration. Ibn Muhayriz, he was raised by his stepfather. So his mother was married. Of course, his father was someone else, but his mother later married Abu Mahdura. Abu Mahdura, who's that? Abu Mahdura is basically a Sahabi that the Prophet ﷺ, this Sahabi was a young man, and obviously he was standing out amongst the Sahaba, at least among not the ones that were really being dedicated to Islam in the beginning. But he was around the guys and he was singing. So it was the guys basically having this moment. It was Abu Mahdura who was having a good time. He was basically the person to sing for them. And the Prophet ﷺ sees Abu Mahdura and basically puts his hand on his chest, makes a dua for him. Later, Abu Mahdura becomes the person that would use his beautiful voice for an adhan. He becomes, along with Abdullah ibn Maktoum, along with Bilal ibn Rabah, Abu Mahdura is the other mu'adhin. So it wasn't just Bilal ibn Rabah that was the mu'adhin. Abu Mahdura was known for his beautiful voice. He too was also one of the mu'adhineen that was along with Bilal and Abdullah ibn Maktoum. That's Abu Mahdura. Ibn Muhayriz was basically one of the tabi'een, one of the later generations, in other words, a generation after the Sahaba, and who was teaching Ibn Muhayriz. It was basically Abu Mahdura. Who is Abu Mahdura? His stepdad. Who is his stepdad? That Sahabi that the Prophet ﷺ had assigned to be the mu'addin. Ya salam. All right, let's continue, inshallah. وَكُلَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهُ الْحُسْنَى. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised al-husna to mean basically Jannah. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ تَوَفَّاهُمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ ظَالِمِي أَنفُسِهِمْ قالوا فيما كنتم قالوا كنا مستضعفين في الأرض قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها. Let's look at that ayah right there. And of course here, درجات منه ومغفرة, I forgot to read that one. So درجات منه ومغفرة is basically to describe what kind of a reward, a magnificent reward, basically different levels of elevation and forgiveness and a mercy, and the Lord Almighty is all forgiving and all mercy. And now going the ayah that we're reading, those that the malaika would take their lives in where they had abused and oppressed themselves, and they were told, what were you doing? What brought you here, that is? So they said, we were just vulnerable on earth. And they would say, wasn't the land of the Lord Almighty wide and spacious enough for you to travel in it? Those are the people that would be granted hellfire, and what a miserable ending that is. A couple of things to read about this ayah. Number one, inshallah, we're going to talk about it right here. The reason for this revelation, at least for that particular ayah, I want you to look at it in where, number one, it was a group of the people from Mecca. Okay, so the people in Mecca definitely were persecuted, and they came to the Prophet ﷺ in order to show that they actually believed in the Prophet ﷺ. But they stayed with their group, they stayed with their people, and what happened is that they had an influence on them, and they basically left Islam even though they had embraced it in the beginning. Of course, the influence of environment, the influence of the pressure, the peer pressure, and of course, during the time of Badr, some, of course, of them had participated with the kuffar. Remember, were they actually believers? They just participated. They were believers in the beginning. All right. And of course, they participated in the battle, but in who and with who? With the kuffar. All right. They didn't take much of it. And this ayah right there, in where some of the Muslims were confused, but they were actually Muslims with us. And in other words, they wanted to give them the justification that they were basically vulnerable. They couldn't tell them that they didn't want to be part and participate. In other words, they rushed in giving them the excuse that they were coerced. All right, they rushed in giving them the excuse that they were coerced, they were forced, etc. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was here mentioning that this would happen on Judgment Day. This actually tells us the whole story about Uzra'il being the angel of death. Is not an authentic hadith. There are different angels that are responsible for ending the life of people, and it's not necessarily Uzra'il. All right, not necessarily the angel Uzra'il. Different angels are responsible for doing that, and they would be on Judgment Day. They would be told, well, why? What led you to all of this? Of course, it's a question of reprimandment. It's a question to basically hold them accountable. And they would say, we were just vulnerable. In other words, they thought that that would give them the excuse to not be held accountable. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the malaika, they would it would basically be refuting and bringing in all the rebuttals that this was at all a good and acceptable justification to not migrate, and to say, well, it was the environment. It wasn't really me. I actually had the good intention, but it was just the environment. So here they would reprimand and say, well, wasn't the earth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wide and spacious enough for you to migrate in it? Now look at that. So this ayah would basically be to show which justifications are considered, and which justifications are considered, and certainly to say it was the environment, it wasn't me, is not an acceptable, is not an accepted justification. And of course, they too had been involved in what would get them out of the fold of Islam. And that's why you had some Muslims, they basically said, but they were Muslim, they were our friends, they were with us, and they were just coerced into all of this. They didn't want to be engaged in all of this. But at the end, and you could see that to complain and to claim that it was the environment, it wasn't me, is not a good enough justification. And which is important, when we're speaking about changing the society that you're in, that's the first step to putting in, let's say, you being committed that you really want the change, changing the environment. Remember the man that killed 100 people in the hadith? The first thing that what he was ordered to do in order to show his commitment was really to leave the city that he was in and basically migrate to a city where there were salihin living there. There were people that were pious living there. Pious people living there, because that would help him basically leave and abandon this behavior that he was always weak in doing, and where he was definitely not doing the best job in holding his temper. All right. Let's see. Let's see here, in where there's another hadith. Ibn Abbas basically said that there were a group of Muslims that were part of al-mushrikeen, even though they did not actually engage in combat during the battle of Badr with the mushrikeen. So they were basically not with the Muslims, but they were on the other side. They weren't engaging in combat, but just by adding a number to those people is basically going to hold you accountable, and therefore the person was basically considered as part of that group, and they cannot say that, well, I was forced, I was coerced. You've got a space for you to actually find another safe place to be in. All right.
So would that be the same for an army that's fighting the Muslimin, and then you know what I mean?
Yeah, they should not join. If it's an army that's fighting the Muslimin, you know what? Exactly like what Muhammad Ali had done. He basically went into prison for basically not join in the army, whether it's Muslimin or not Muslimin.
Yes, subhanAllah.
Even let's say when the US went into the Vietnam War, that was not a fair war. So whether it's Muslims or not Muslims, killing a human life in injustice is basically haram. Whether it's Muslims or not Muslims, but certainly when it's Muslims, the let's say the crime is even doubled.
Yeah.
The crime is doubled. So you can't say, well, I was coerced, I was forced, I was going to lose my job, I wasn't going to get the college pensions and all of that. That's not an excuse.
Yeah.
If you're asked to join in something that is haram to join in, don't join in it. And you can't say, well, I was forced. They told me, you know what? There are certain things. There are certain things that you cannot claim that you were coerced in it. Number one, you can never claim that I was coerced to kill somebody. If somebody was to pull a trigger and say, kill X or I will kill you, that doesn't give you the justification to kill X, because your life is not of a higher sanctity than the other person's life. Number two, zina. To actually say, well, I was forced to rape that woman. I was forced. They told me they'd kill me if I didn't do it. I was forced. No, that would never give you the justification to actually go and rape a woman and say I was forced. Number three, to beat your parents, to say, oh, I basically beat my parents, not because I wanted to, but because I was forced. So that's not a justification. That's not an acceptable reason. So when you're looking at that, you're seeing for a person to actually say, well, I didn't know what to do. Well, what you didn't know what to do in that situation, if you were coerced, accept to you yourself actually be killed than actually kill someone else. And this is extremely
fair for going over that. Sorry, I didn't mean to get another.
No, that's all right. That's all right. All right. So فيما كنتم, and of course, when you're looking at فيما كنتم, it says تقرير وتوبيخ. And توبيخ actually means a reprimandment. So here, this is not to ask them. So this wasn't a question. So this was really to reflect. What is تقرير? To reflect basically the الحال. Right there, قالوا فيما كنتم. So this is not that they're asking them, but this is in order to inform their hal, to inform the situation that they were in when they were asked what was happening. They either said literally كنا مستضعفين في الأرض. Remember we said there's a لسان المحال and لسان المقال. In other words, they literally said we were vulnerable, we had no choice. It could be that they literally said that. It could also mean لسان الحال, that they had described themselves, the situation was describing that they were like, well, we didn't have the power to do anything, we didn't know what to do. So they were basically speaking at least of a body language that's what they wanted to say. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there, so this is taqreer and tawbih, when right here when it says taqreer and tawbih, and what the malaika were telling them, well, you don't really have a good excuse, because you had the option to basically travel, to leave. Does everybody have that option is the question. And of course, when you look at that, not everyone has that option. We know not that, and not everyone is capable of traveling. So that's where this illa is basically to give that exception, in where who's excluded? They couldn't travel. إلا المستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والولدان لا يستطيعون حيلة ولا يهتدون سبيلا. Except the ones that were really vulnerable, that were really weak, that really had no choice, that were the ones that didn't have a choice, indeed, from men that didn't have the power to travel, women that didn't have the power to travel, or even children where they had hila. What is al-hila? Al-hila is basically the capacity. They didn't have the capacity to travel. They probably didn't have the money. They probably didn't have, I guess, the visa. Who knows what obstacles they're having, or probably even the circumstances weren't yet helping them to travel. ولا يهتدون سبيلا. ولا يهتدون سبيلا, and where they didn't really have the capacity. So an example for these is basically that was really مأواهم جهنم وساءت. So let's see right there in where, maybe you could see it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically had given this exception, such as Ayyash ibn Abi Rabi'a and Salamat ibn Hisham. The Prophet ﷺ had made the dua for them. Ibn Abbas said, I was amongst those that were weak. So in other words, let's see, said, I was amongst these. Remember, this is illa to mean an exception. What if somebody was really weak and they couldn't really go? So Ibn Abbas had actually said, I was amongst those that were weak and couldn't. It was me and my mom, and we were basically referred to by this ayah. And of course, his mom was al-Fadl bint al-Harith, and her name was Lubaba. Her name was Lubaba. And her sister's name was Maymuna. All right. And her younger sister was Lubaba Sughra. I don't know why they would have two sisters actually have the same name, but anyhow. And there are 9 sisters, and they're the sisters that so you've got Lubaba, you got Maymuna, and there's the ones that the Prophet ﷺ called them al-akhawatu mu'minat, the believing sisters. Yeah, that's so beautiful. The believing sisters, let's say. And al-akhawat mu'minat, basically Maymuna, the Prophet ﷺ's wife, al-Fadl bint al-Harith, who's actually Abdullah ibn Abbas's mother, Salma, the Hamza's wife, Asma bint Umays, basically their mother from their, not their mother, but their sister from their mother's side. All right, so this would be al-akhawat al-arba, so 9 or 4 sisters. And there's another one, Salma wal-Asma'u wa Hufayda. Salma is basically the wife of Hamza, we said? Yes, Hamza's wife. Okay, Al-Asma, let's see Al-Asma. I don't really know who she is. Let's see, Al-Asma tulaqab bil-Asma. Oh, that's Lubaba Sughra. Okay, so Lubaba Sughra is Al-Asma. Okay, so 2 sisters, Lubaba. Lubaba actually means the coring of something. Okay, يقال في حفيدة حفيد اسمها هزيلة. What a name. Why would they name Huzayla? Huzayla actually means the weak one. Why would they name such names? Anyhow, some scholars said that they were 6. Other scholars said that they were 4. Other scholars said that they were 9. Let's see. So these 3 sisters from the mom's side, Salma, Salama, and Asma. Salama. Salama is a girl's name. In Palestine, we give Salama for a boy's name. So Salama is a girl's name. It was a Sahabiya. Her name is Salama. Asma bint Umays al-Khathamiyya, and she's the wife of Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. Well, Asma bint Umays was actually married to Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, later Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, later Umar ibn al-Khattab, later Uthman ibn Affan, and later Ali ibn Abi Talib. And it was known that Asma bint Umays, that whoever gets married to her was basically going to become a shaheed. So you want to become a shaheed, you would marry Asma bint Umays. And the wife of Bakr as-Siddiq and Imrat Ali. Okay, so Fima Kuntum, so they were amongst the vulnerable. Okay, Fima Kuntum, why didn't you travel? I want you to look at this. When they were basically told, Alam takun ardullahi wasi'a, and this ayah is basically an evidence that to depart and leave the city in where sin is done in it. So let's quote, وفي هذه الآية دليل على هجران الأرض التي يعمل فيها بالمعاصي. So this is an ayah that proves that it is obligatory to leave the earth or the land or the country or the city that basically sin is basically done in it. And of course, Sa'id ibn Jubayr had said, quote, Sa'id ibn Jubayr was actually killed. He's a tabi'i. He was killed by al-Hajjaj. He said, إذا عمل بالمعاصي في أرض فاخرج منها. If a particular land is basically, or if any sin was done on any particular land, or in other words, city, etc., then leave it. And in other words, travel out of it. Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, quote, let's look at this hadith, and here it is. Suyuti had said that it was Ibn Mardaway, hadith Abu Darda, and he said that al-Hafidh had said hadith al-Kashaf. Okay, so this hadith is mursal basically. Let's still quote it. All right. من فر بدينه من أرض إلى أرض وإن كان شبرا استوجب الجنة وكان رفيق إبراهيم ومحمد عليهما السلام. This hadith is beautiful. Whoever departs or runs away from a city for their faith, from one land or city to another, even if that was as small as a shibr. Shibr is like an inch, then they would actually be granted Jannah. So when you look at istawjaba, it's like it's obligatory, it's mandatory for sure that they're actually going to go to Jannah, and they would be companions to Ibrahim, Prophet Ibrahim and Muhammad alayhi salam. Ya Allah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all the reward of leaving the cities in where Ameen ya Rabbi. It's Ya Allah, it's not easy. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ya Rabbi give us the reward for leaving those cities in where just for the sake of our children's deen, for the sake of our deen. And of course, al-hijrah would become, to migrate would become obligatory on every single person that had become Muslim at the time. I want you to keep in mind. So when this ayah was speaking about hijrah, this was the obligatory hijrah. The obligatory hijrah at the time was to migrate from Mecca to Medina. From Mecca to Medina. Right now, the circumstances are different in where, of course, the circumstances being different, the cities right now, believe it or not, in some Muslim countries, you're not capable of practicing your Islam, and you would be more capable of probably practicing your Islam in non-Muslim countries, ironically. But this is the case for certain countries, for certain people, for certain situations. So you would have to really figure out your situation to see what brings in a better contribution for your deen and your children's deen. الحيلة, so لا يستطيعون. حيلة, basically you could see that is not defined. This is not talking about al-hila, but hila is basically here nakira, in a state where it is not defined. So basically all the different kinds of reasons, could be a visa, could be money, could be maybe that you were not, basically you had you were on the no-fly zone list or whatever, so you really didn't have the ability. You don't have the ability to leave. You basically don't even have the visa. If you were to probably leave, you might actually lose your papers, and who knows where you'll end up, and probably put yourself in a dangerous situation. And certainly preserving your life is also important. That's also a considerable reason. But of course, you want to always seek what is best in preserving your deen, your life, your family, your mental health, and certainly your property as well. So those that did not have al-hila, the power, or let's say the ability to travel, then in that situation, they would not be held accountable. And what if it's my husband? I really want to travel, but my husband is the one that's saying that, no, we can't travel yet, etc. And I would really want to. You will get the reward of a person that traveled. And in that situation, you would basically, one, you will get the reward, two, and you would basically stick with your husband, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, would bring in the change, would bring in the change. So stick with your husband, and this is obligatory. Sticking, unless it's the Dajjal coming out, then even if your husband tells you, we're going to stick here and we're going to stay here, you know, you got to go to Medina. You know, you got to go to Medina as soon as possible. Or go to Mecca. If it's the Dajjal, it's a different story. All right. And it's important, of course, to recognize, even if when we're talking about probably the burden of travel, that the burden of travel is definitely inevitable. So we can't say, oh, it's going to be a burden. We have to pay tickets and we're going to have to probably carry all of that. It's too much work to do to leave. That's not what would be considered as a good reason. This is within the ability. Yes, it's a hardship that is hectic, but it is still within your ability. So what we're speaking about, لا يستطيعون حيلة, in where it is beyond your control, it is beyond your power. All right, let's see. وَمَن يُهَاجِرْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. Let's look at this ayah. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and whoever migrates for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would find on earth مُرَاغَمًا كَثِيرًا وَسَعًا. They would find provisions, they would find basically ease. Yes, it's a transition, but you're going to find a lot of ease. And whoever migrates from their home, migrates for the sake of Allah Almighty and the Prophet, and then death comes on to them, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reward them, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one to reward them and compensate them for that. And the Lord Almighty is Ghafuran Rahima, and the Lord Almighty is all merciful and all forgiving. This is going to be the last ayah that we're going to do today, inshallah. Let's see. وَمَن يُهَاجِرْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. So when you're looking at this ayah, it was basically to speak about, well, this is talking about the people that didn't migrate. What about the person that migrates? What are they going to get? So whenever you would see an ayah, one that's reprimanding them from doing something, you're going to find another ayah that's going to be talking about if you were to do it, basically to encourage you. All right. And he basically here, Ibn Abbas, he said, al-muragham. Okay, no, I want to actually get you to, okay. So, وَمَن يُهَاجِرْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ يَجِدْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Whoever travels for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would find different alternatives. Basically, they would find different areas, and despite all the hardships. So here, of course, he would basically, some scholars said al-muragham yajid fil ardi muraghaman. So in other words, the question is, what would they find if they were to travel? So it's like وَمَن يُهَاجِرْ. So here's basically the condition. If you were to travel, what's going to happen? يجد في الأرض مراغما. You would find مراغما كثيرا. So the scholars actually had differences of opinions on what al-muragham is. In other words, what am I going to find? Number one, al-mutazahza. Basically that you're going to find the space away from all the pressure that is taking you away from your deen. That's the first interpretation. The second interpretation is basically the transition away from all of this. All right. In other words, you'll have the space, the transition, you'll basically find whatever is going to be the implication of moving out coming at you, and it's going to be something that is giving you definitely the ease in making you being capable of adopting and embracing your deen going to be easier. Okay, and of course he says إنما سمي مهاجرا ومراغما لأن الرجل إذا أسلم أعاد قومه وهاجرهم. So here مراغما, basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so this the scholars, they said the reason why they were called muhajar or muragham was really because if the person had migrated, that would by, of course, his own people, it would resemble as if they had abandoned their family and abandoned basically his own people. So that's when, in other words, there's a price to pay, that you had left your people, you had left your work, you had left the city that you were accustomed to. And remember when we talked about that before, when it talked about if a person was expelled out of their home or killed, and we said expelled out of their home or killed is basically when your body departs your soul. But when you're expelled out of your home, your soul is basically connected to that place, connected to the land, connected to the people, connected to the income that you were getting in that place. And then to actually leave, it's taking you physically, but you know that your heart is still connected elsewhere. And of course, the Prophet ﷺ was muragham because he himself had actually left his people and to seek lil-ma'isha. Al-muragham mubtaghi lil-ma'isha. They're seeking also the means to live. And let's continue right here because they'll find basically rizq, they'll find a place to, I guess, get a job, they'll find rizq, even though it's probably not going to be as abundant, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them rizq. And I was always saying, I'd rather have my children actually live and get, and probably, if they're good in their deen, actually sell spices in the city of Karachi, than actually live and in a place of probably kufr and have a PhD from Harvard or whatever it is, and lose their deen. And this is important. It's not about the degree. It's not about the money. You can have all of those prestigious labelings, but what good does it make in the akhirah if that label is there, but the label of iman is not there? So you have to just keep in mind that you have to put in the contribution to basically live in a place where it brings in a contribution in your children's deen and in your deen. Malik said this ayah is an evidence that no one should stay in a land where the Salaf or the Salihin, of course, the Salihin throughout history, the Salaf are basically here, يسب فيها السلف. In other words, this is referring really to Shia because they would be the ones to speak ill of the Sahaba. So he said that you should not be in the land in where the Sahaba are disrespected, and or even the Salihin are disrespected, and in any يعمل فيها بغير الحق, or even if there's any wrongdoing in it, what you need to find is really a safe place to be in. So the question is, I want you to take you right there. Why did this ayah even, who is the person, يخرج من بيته مهاجرا إلى الله ورسوله? Who was the one that went? Was this referring to one particular person? This ما يهاجر في سبيل الله. Was this referring to a particular person, or is this in general? So yes, it is in general, but there is a particular person that was referred to in this ayah. So let's see. Ikrama, Mawla ibn Abbas. When you look at Mawla, that actually means he was a slave, but then later freed. He said, for 14 years, I seeked his name until I found his name. So seeked his name to know who that really was, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically أعلى ذكره, had basically mentioned him, and for other people to take as an inspiration, for other people to take as a good role model. And who that was, he said it was Damra ibn al-Ais. It was Damra ibn al-Ais or al-Ais ibn Damra. So basically, differences of opinions on who that Sahabi's, what that Sahabi, at least exactly the same name. But what happened is that he was an ill man. He was an ill man. And when he heard this ayah, the previous ayah that basically had obligated that they would travel, he said, أخرجوني فهويئ له فرس. He said, get me out. In other words, even though he can't go, he's completely and terminally ill, but he said, get me out. So they prepared for him a horse, and he sat on it. And basically, of course, if you're ill, you can't handle it. Of course, you would need all the hydration, he needs the money, he needs the food, he needs all of that. But of course, certainly he wasn't capable of traveling, but he actually died in the middle of the way, and it was in the area in Tan'im. Tan'im is near Bayt Sayyidah Aisha, so basically right at the suburbs of Mecca. Basically, that's even at Tan'im, that's a place for that you could actually do an ihram from if you passed al-miqat. So in certain circumstances. Anyhow, other scholars had said it was Khalid ibn Hizam ibn Khuwaylid. Khalid ibn Hizam ibn Khuwaylid ibn Akhi. So that basically the nephew of Sayyidah Khadija, that it was Khalid ibn Hizam when he had migrated to the city of Al-Habasha, Abyssinia, Ethiopia. And then in the middle of the way, a snake basically eats him up somehow, swallows him. And of course, he dies before even getting to the land of Habasha. Getting to the land of Habasha was basically the goal, but he dies before even getting there. In other words, it's very similar to the guy that killed 100 people, at least did he actually make it? He didn't make it. He didn't even make it to the new city, but he invested at least in the effort to go there. Let's see right there in where leaving the city, scholars had actually considered, Ibn al-Arabi had mentioned that scholars had mentioned that there would be two reasons for why you would leave a city. Number one is basically a person that is fleeing the city or even seeking certain privileges. So the first one, basically fleeing the city, is basically a person that would do hijrah, migration, to leave and migrate from Dar al-Harb ila Dar al-Islam. Right now, there is no Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam, that was the classification during that time, in where Dar al-Islam was basically the place of Khilafah, and Dar al-Harb was basically the place where the enemies were basically ruling. All right, and it was obligatory to do the hijrah from Mecca to Medina. But after 8th year hijrah, that obligation ended. So you can't say, I want to migrate from Mecca to Medina. So this hijrah, in where you're leaving for the sake of your deen, would basically be باقية مفروضة إلى يوم القيامة. It would basically be forever until Judgment Day. It would be obligatory to basically travel from the land that you're not capable of practicing your deen in to a land that you're capable of practicing your deen in. Let's see the other type of fleeing. It's basically fleeing the city that is practicing innovation. Ibn al-Qasim is one of the most important scholars who basically transmitted the madhab Maliki. He said, I heard Malik say, لا يحل لأحد أن يقيم بأرض يسب فيها السلف. I heard Malik say that it was not permissible for anybody to live on a land where the Salaf would basically mean the Sahaba or even the scholars, where they are here, of course, spoken ill about. Ibn al-Arabi said, yes, indeed. Ibn al-Arabi is also Maliki. He said, if you're not capable of changing this wrongdoing, then in that situation, you have to leave that place. Let's say exactly the quote. إن المنكر إذا لم تقدر أن تغيره فزل عنه. If you cannot change the evil doing, then you basically depart it. You leave it. Leave that area, which is really the same words as when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَ الَّذِينَ يَخُوضُونَ فِي آيَاتِنَا فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُم. If you see those that would engage and speak wrong about the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then leave them. You shouldn't be sitting with them. So in the third kinds. So we talked about the two kinds, which is number one, al-hijra, and we also talked about al-khuruj from the city of bid'ah. Let's see the third kind. It's basically al-khuruj min ardin ghalab alayha al-haram. It's leaving and basically departing and migrating from a land where the wrongdoing, al-haram, basically people engaging in haram is becoming predominant. People are predominantly engaging in haram. So what you need to seek is really something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as halal. You need to seek a place that engages in halal, and it becomes obligatory on every Muslim. Let's see the other kind. Al-firaru min al-idayati fil badan. Basically fleeing from the harm that might be inflicted upon your body, right? And which is the easiest thing. Well, probably that's maybe their time, but anyhow. So basically, let's say that a person, they know that if they were to go to Syria, that Bashar and Assad's army would probably force them or probably beat them or probably harm them in that way. Then in that situation, that is the harm on your body. Then in that situation, leaving to protect and preserve your life, preserve your health is also a priority as well. And of course, the first one to leave and depart the area to protect their body and their health and their life was basically Ibrahim alayhi salam. He basically had feared and he said, Inni muhajirun ila Rabbi. I am here migrating for the sake of my Lord. In another ayah, he said, Inni dhahibun ila Rabbi sayahdin. I am going to travel for my Lord Almighty. He would be the one to guide me. Guide me, why? And of course, about Prophet Musa alayhi salam, فَخَرَجَ مِنْهَا خَائِفًا يَتَرَقَّبْ. Even Musa alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said he had left the city in fear and yataraqqab, in total scrutiny. He was just concerned about what is behind there, am I being watched, etc. All right. The fifth kind of basically migration is the fear of illness. So in that situation, you're basically leaving because a particular illness is common in a certain area, maybe because I guess no clean water or maybe no clean resources. And basically you decided that you wanted to leave in order to be healthy, except there is an exception here if there is the plague. So plague in that situation, the Prophet ﷺ had forbid to leave the city if the city basically had plague in it, that you do not want to leave the city, because if you were to leave, the chances are you're going to basically bring the disease to other people and basically get other cities ill in that situation. So you want to make sure that you practice the quarantine in order to get and make sure that other people stay healthy. الفرار خوف الإذاية خوف الإذاية. Basically running away because you're in fear of harm on your wealth. So in that situation, of course, it's my wealth. Yes, even if your money is in danger, because you want to keep in mind that your wealth is also كحرمة دمه. Your wealth is to be respected, is to be certainly considered of a high sanctity, exactly like a person's life and even your family. So in that situation, we would basically consider that there is, yes, a reason for your deen, where what you're seeking is the preservation for your deen and even preservation for your dunya as well. So even in that situation, whether if you're migrating because number one, you're trying to migrate because you want to see in this world, you're traveling just to seek al-ibra, to seek the lesson, to seek an inspiration from something. So that's basically to apply what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَوَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَيَنْظُرُوا كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. Have they not traveled within the earth to see the consequence of those that had come before them. And of course, whether we're talking about the Dhul Qarnayn, who basically traveled on earth in order to see the different amazing things on earth, or even to apply justice. The other kind of travel is basically the travel for Hajj. All right, so the first one at least is fard. All right, the second one is basically going to be a sunnah. All right, safar al-jihad, basically the traveling for jihad, and this one basically has all these different rulings. So safar al-ma'ash, basically a person is traveling for a good income. All right, and in that situation, what they're trying to seek is basically an income. They're probably seeking better risk, better job, etc. Then in that situation, same thing with a person that's traveling for increasing their income. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَبْتَغُوا فَضْلًا مِّن رَبِّكُم, that there's no sin on you if you were basically seeking. The word ibtigha actually means to seek from the different bounties of your Lord Almighty. And here he said, يعني التجارة, meaning business. So whether it's a business or whether it's basically a job. So let's say you're hired within a certain job. It doesn't have to be business to mean in trade, but it could be business to mean getting a job, and that you're basically in that job and that's where you would make better money, right? Or even the sixth one was seeking ilm. So to travel to seek ilm, to get a degree, etc. Or even qasdul biqa', with the intention that the reason why you're traveling is لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى 3 مساجد, that the reason why you're traveling was really to get to certain areas that are blessed. And the certain areas that are blessed, according to this hadith, number one is that al-Masjid al-Haram, basically al-Kaaba. Number two is al-Medina. And number 3 is al-Masjid al-Aqsa. Number 8 is basically al-Thuhur lil-Ribat. So basically migrating in those areas that are considered of dangerous spots that are near, let's say, occupation, or at least near the dangerous areas right at the battlefront. All right, so you're talking about, when you look at certain areas, they have a high chance of being probably attacked by the enemy. They have a high chance of being in danger, etc. So that's a thought. Like when you look at al-Masjid al-Aqsa right now, yeah, you've got some Muslims living there, but there's a price to pay. Many times we would actually think, oh, they're just living there normally and all of that. There's actually a price to pay, because Israel is not only attacking their life, but even their deen. They would spread drugs for free there. We would have a lot of Palestinians in and around al-Masjid al-Aqsa actually have access to drugs for free. And we have a lot of addiction around al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So it's actually not easy living in a place of thuhur, because your deen is also going to be at stake. Addiction is real. The hardship in even building homes and expanding and living like a normal life is definitely a very hard thing. And the 9th one, which inshallah we'll leave it right there, ziyarat al-ikhwan fillah, to visit your Muslim brother or sister for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's see this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, quote, a man had visited another man, his brother, basically not biological brother, but a Muslim brother, in another city. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had let an angel trace the stations that he was in. And then the angel appears to him in a human form. And he said, where are you going? And of course he knows, but he said, where are you going? And he said, I am actually going to visit a brother, a Muslim brother or sister, of course, Muslim brother for me in this city. And the angel asked, is there any other reason, another provision that you're coming there for? He said, no, I just love him for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I basically want to visit him for that, just really for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm not there not to issue some papers or do anything. No, I'm just really there just because of that Muslim brother wanted to visit him. So this is talking about a brother to a brother, not a sister going to visit a Muslim brother. All right. All right. So the Malaika said, فَإِنِّي رَسُولُ اللَّهِ إِلَيْكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَبَّكَ كَمَا أَحْبَبْتَهُ فِي. And the Malaika, or the angel, he said, I am the messenger of your Lord Almighty, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had loved you as you loved him. As you had loved him. And you could see this hadith is actually authentic. It's an authentic hadith. All right, I'm going to stop right here. We definitely passed the time, but there was a lot to say and I had to say it. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all mutahabbin fillah, make us all from those that would love one another fi sabilillah, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them really quick. Exactly, quick. I guess no one has any questions because we definitely passed the time. Completely understand. Completely understand. So we'll end it right
Very
here.
good, though, mashallah.
I know.